Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what I do with the Pele and Hi'iaka book. Just a real brief background for those of you who might not be familiar. Pele is the Hawaiian goddess of the volcano who migrates from Tahiti, specifically Pora Pora, which is known in the Western world as Bora Bora. I was corrected many times in Tahiti by the Maohi people there, which is also the land of my ancestors. Her youngest and favorite sister is Hi'iaka Ikapolio Pele, who's also a goddess, who is associated with the regeneration of the native forest, with hula, with healing, and with the life-affirming and death-dealing arts of ana, which is often miscast as sorcery or witchcraft. The book focuses on the social, cultural, historical, and political meanings of the Pele and Hi'iaka mo'olelo. In my early introduction to the topic as a master's student, I was fascinated with how in the Hawaiian language accounts from newspapers to hula training through my family and their stories from growing up in the lands of Pele, both in Hawaii Island as well as Kauai and in between, that they were understood and characterized, these goddesses and their importance, very differently from popularized Western accounts that were often collected, interpreted, and disseminated by armchair anthropologists and supposed ethnographers, mostly American white men, and they were collected in part to peddle them to foreigners. Look at our new acquisition, new territory of Hawaii after overthrow and annexation, for example, and part of the building of the tourist industry from that time forward. And we still see that in effect today as well. Within a span of about 80 years, or just under that, there are about 13 separate versions of the mo'olelo that were published in Hawaiian language newspapers, and there's also other accounts that were not published per se, but were handwritten in handwritten journals that came out, like the Miley Wreath, which was associated with W.D. Alexander and students at Punahou. The publication of traditional mo'olelo is widely known by a number of us who regularly access the vast Hawaiian language newspaper archives for different reasons. And these mo'olelo in general, not just Pele and Hi'iaka, were often very prominently featured in Hawaiian language newspapers, used to entice readers to buy or subscribe to the paper. And they were popular not just because they provided entertainment in the days before television, radio, and Netflix, for example, but the mo'olelo were primary vehicles of recording and passing on history, cultural knowledge, values, and practices. Many writers and editors were explicit in the value of the mo'olelo in this way, often mentioning that they were important to keep alive the knowledge of our ancestors for the benefit of the youth and for future generations like us, whom they would never know, to instill pride in the richness and depth of our Hawaiian heritage, particularly at a time when colonialism was putting much pressure on them to change everything about who they were: their language, their names, their dress, their religion, government, land tenure system, educational system, domestic roles and organizations, and so forth. So in the course of my research, I saw a pattern of using Pele and Hi'iaka mo'olelo during times of more intense political turmoil, such as in 1893 when the overthrow occurred. Pele and Hi'iaka was, I think, in the third installment at the time that, of one particular version during the overthrow in January of 1893. So I argue that this is significant because of the encoded concepts in the mo'olelo, such as hulihia, which means to overturn. And it's what Pele does when she sends out her lava flow. Her lava flows then and now, which are still flowing today, hulihia on the aina, it overturns the land. And this is particularly important because she's a female deity, no less, who is able to overturn the established order of the male gods. Puna in Hawaii is also poetically known as Kaupu o Kane, or the bosom of Kane. She also disrupts Kanaloa's realm of the ocean when her lava flows into the sea. There's vast kinolau of the male gods in the forest that are destroyed and removed through the lava flows, which then reshape and renew the land, and all done without retribution from the male gods. This concept is foundational to the Hawaiian worldview of lava flows. When the current flows began in the late 80s down in Kaimu, Kapa'ahu area, where my family is from, many of the newer Haole residents in Puna grieved for the loss of their properties and material possessions. A lot of this is documented on video, which is widely available. My ohana, on the other hand, as with many other Hawaiian ohana of the area with generational ties, simply saw it as tutu pele, as Uncle Robert Keli Ko'omalu has said, just cleaning out the rubbish. And during the recent flows, heading to Pahoa, while others have been bemoaning their personal losses once again, some of my cousins have been on the news and other Hawaiians exclaiming, clean your house, get ready, Tutu Pele is coming for a visit and welcome her. In both cases, Hawaiian homes have not been lost. We have really important geological features on our family's land, like Punalu'u, which most people know as Queen's Bath, has been reclaimed, but no homes were ever lost. And within the idea, when I talked about women in my family, one of my aunties who was, I think in her 70s, when the lava flow came to the Kapa'ahu lands and kind of made it impossible to live in the house, lived in her truck by herself for a couple months while she rebuilt her house herself. So compared to that, writing a dissertation was really not that hard. Mana wahine. Okay, so getting back to the questions on the approaches of the framework for my research, I look at not just at feminist theory per se, but within the context of indigenous theories and literary nationalism, which started in the late 90s within Native American literary studies. And simply put, indigenous literary nationalism is an approach that places indigenous intellectual and cultural values at the center of analysis rather than at the margins. It acknowledges the powerful and sophisticated intellectual foundation of Native peoples and is avowedly political as it asserts the active presence of indigenous values in our literature. So the literature is the focus of what I do, which of course extends out into community and land and politics, because literature is one part of our expression of our experiences and how we document that. So it also looks at how the critical lenses of the source cultures or the native cultures are important to how we conduct analysis. And within the Pacific, the concept of mana wahine, or female empowerment, is of course a central part of the analysis of the literature in my work. So while indigenous literary nationalism has, for the most part, focused on contemporary literature from the 20th century to the present in English, I extended it with Pele and Hi'iaka literature into the 19th century, off the continent, into the Pacific, with literature written in our native language in Olelo, Hawaii, and then sometimes, but not always, looking at translations into English as well. And I'm now starting to extend that work beyond just Pele and Hi'iaka, but looking at other kinds of mo'olelo of some of our male hero figures, as well as other female heroine and goddess figures, to see if the metaphor works as well as it does with Pele and Hi'iaka literature. So looking in the framework, using some of the methodologies of indigenous literary nationalism really helped give me the courage to kind of take that leap between earlier master's work into doctoral work in asserting Hawaiian cultural concepts as both the theoretical lens and the methodology, the framework for what I do. So for example, going back to genealogy and mo'okuauhau, one of the things that I discuss is the importance of acknowledging that. And one of the things I talk about, especially in my classes with my graduate students, is this idea that we may not all have a biological mo'okuauhau to specific place in culture, but we have intellectual mo'okuauhau through the professors, teachers, community people we work with, as well as to the disciplines that we study in. And that becomes just as important, and for some scholars perhaps more important, when there isn't a biological DNA genealogy that they have to a particular subject of their studies. That as part of that is a concept of what I call in the book kuleana consciousness. And kuleana is both, a lot of people think it's your right to do something, but it's also responsibility that's inherent in those rights. So the idea of being very conscious and aware as individual peoples, to our mo'okuauhau, as scholars, to our disciplinary or intellectual mo'okuauhau, to the communities and the cultures that we study, as well as to the topics. These are all really important, that we have to know what our background, what our place is, and our relationship with and to the communities we're a part of or that we're working with, and not be the bad scholar who just sort of breezes in, extracts data, writes up the paper, gets credit, and then zooms out, and there's never a connection there ever again, right? In addition, I use cultural metaphors such as the construction of a lei as demonstrating relationship of mo'olelo to each other. So in an earlier article, I talk about how if we look at each mo'olelo or each narrative as a flower, right? And you have flowers in the forest, and then you can pick the flowers and you can create a bouquet. That's a different use and sort of aesthetic and purpose than if you take the flowers and string them together into a lei, which becomes a different type of aesthetic value and has a different purpose and use. And that even within the construction of a lei, there's multiple techniques, there's multiple kinds of flowers and foliage, and nowadays we make lei out of candy and money and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So we can utilize that as a way to look at the multiple approaches to how we can interpret and analyze our indigenous literature. And then another one that I utilize, in a sense, a little bit different than what we tend to see, is the metaphor of the va'a, which of course we see a lot with navigating across the Pacific. Sometimes it's used in a more masculine way with navigation and all of the great men who navigated back in time to populate the Pacific. But va'a is a particular concept that's applied to Pele and the lava flow itself. So the lava flow becomes a va'a that moves the land, literally, and the lava becomes like the sea, and that in that way, the va'a becomes the container that carries the concepts of culture in the mo'olelo, not just across space from one island to another in the Pacific, but across time, so from one generation to another, that these things remain with us. And because when we look at Pele and Hi'iaka, it's such a manawahine-centered mo'olelo, issues of female power are integral to my work with literature because of the different gender dynamics that are inherent throughout the mo'olelo. So one of the things that I like to stress is that the concept of manawahine is one that we see. I first started reading about it in the early 90s coming out of Aotearoa with Maori women's community work and activism with land rights issues, and utilizing it more within a Hawaiian context. And it's explicitly different from Western feminism. So I try not to call it Native Pacific feminism for a reason, but female empowerment within a cultural context because of two specific things that are very important. One is that it's not female empowerment separate from the men or the rest of the family or the community, that there's a recognition of role. It may not be separate and equal in a Western sense, but it's definitely separate with an idea that each contributes to maintaining or rebuilding the whole, and the whole being the whole family, parents, children, older generations in the family, younger generations to come, and then the rest of the community. So it's not pitting women against men. And the other thing that's very important is the connection to aina and specific aina, right? Where your family comes from, or where you're born, where you're raised, so on and so forth. So these are two very important values with the concept of manawahine that is different from, and speaking very broadly, Western feminism. So that comes up a lot as well within Pele and Hi'iaka literature, because Pele is literally the land and the creator of land, and Hi'iaka is one who refurbishes the land through her connection with the forest. So it also becomes important because I also teach courses in Western literature, and I teach a course on occasion on fairy tale adaptations. And in that course, we discuss how a lot of the popular Western tales promote heterosexual male patriarchy, where the supposed good woman is the one who is passive. We literally have a sleeping beauty waiting for her Prince Charming to save her, where a happily ever after ending suggests marriage, children, and economic prosperity, and that this is the only viable scenario for good girls raised within a Christian tradition. A high value is placed on virginity at the time of marriage. Marrying is the only option for a successful or prosperous life. No individual identity as a woman. You are first the dutiful daughter or granddaughter, then the dutiful wife, then the loving mother and grandmother. And that people tend to forget that there were Western tales of clever girls which were not popularized or included in collection by the male folklorists like Charles Perrault in France or the Grimm brothers in Germany, and that modern adaptations bring these tales or new rendition of these old tales to light. So we tend to forget that, but that is an important difference. In the world of traditional Hawaiian mo'olelo, many women have sex before marriage. They have sex with other women as well as with men without being socially stigmatized or punished. Matchmaking games such as Kilu are exciting episodes to see who will end up with who for the night, not forever, but for the night, and who else the next night. Women proposition men as well as other women as much as men did. And it's not uncommon, such as with Hina and Aiwohi Kupua in the story of Laie Kawai, which just played wonderfully on stage at Kennedy this past couple weeks, to have hula contests or surfing contests or ho'opapa, a contest of wits in which the bet is something like, if I win, this is the woman, if I win, I will get to sleep with you. And if you win, you will get to sleep with me. Okay. So marriage, childbearing, and economic security are not the ultimate goal for the female heroines, in part because traditional society recognized this separation of responsibilities in society, that all who worked or were too old or too young to do so were provided and cared for, and that the extended family, including men, helped in the raising of the children. This was all very normal for grandparents to raise children or take on primary responsibilities, so mothers and fathers could attend to their different kuleana. So I'm going to stop there for now, but most important is recognizing there really is a different foundation in the cultural worldviews that are implicit in the literature, which is why our traditional stories are so important.